Now, the Electoral Commission of South Africa, the IEC, could be forced to remove about 1.3 million people from the voters' roll if the Constitutional Court fails to grant it an extension to secure addresses for these voters. In court papers filed last week, the IEC asked for an extension of a further 17 months to comply with an earlier Constitutional Court order on fixing the voters' roll. If the IEC is unable to complete the roll, it may result in voters being removed from the roll. For more on this issue, we are joined by Granville Abrahams, who is the Senior Manager for Electoral Operations at the IEC. Good evening to you, and thank you for talking to us this evening. I mean, quite apart from anything else, this most certainly means there can be no chance of an early general election, certainly not this year.
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity, Bongani, to clarify the matter. I think that most importantly, we should acknowledge that this matter is before the court and give the court the space and the time that it requires to consider the matter and decide on that. I think it's a bit premature to begin to say that voters will not be allowed to vote, because that is certainly not the position of the Electoral Commission.
Well, of course, but obviously we have to look at whatever possibilities may arise. If that extension isn't granted to you, that at the very least would mean, theoretically, that there can't be elections early than might be anticipated.
Well, the Electoral Commission is mandated to manage free and fair elections, and whenever that is required in terms of the Constitution, then we are obviously supposed to be doing that.
Well, of course. Let's just go back to how we arrived here. You said the matter is before the courts, but of course, as I said in my introduction, it all stems from a ConCourt ruling from 2016 that extended the deadline towards the end of this month.
That is
the deadline you're not able to meet.
Well, yes, correct. In our papers filing for an extension, we have shown the court that we had made significant progress. I think that viewers should be aware of the fact at the outset we had about 8 million voters without addresses, and we are currently saying now for those post-2003, when the legislation came in, we're sitting at 1.3. In the papers that we have filed with the ConCourt as well, we have said that we have proved to say that we have done significant work, we have addresses, but it's a matter of confirming the usability of those addresses, and it's for that matter that we require the extension. So it's not as if there is no end in sight or solution in sight. We have proved in our papers that we are doing the work and we have addresses that we are processing.
Well, obviously, in all likelihood, you may indeed get the extension if the court is convinced by the arguments that you present. On the, shall we call it, the unlikely event that it doesn't give you that extension, what would it mean for a poll if those voters were to be excluded?
Well, I think it's a bit premature for us to express a view on that matter, Bongani, with due respect.
Sure, but this conversation is in no way going to influence what the court will decide. I think the court will decide quite independently of our conversation. But I do think voters who are watching this interview will want to know what are the likely scenarios should the situation not go in the way that you would like.
Well, the individual's right to vote is entrenched in the Constitution in terms of Chapter 19, their political rights. So it is very difficult to foresee a situation whereby the 1.3 or 1.2, whatever the figure is, of voters would be disenfranchised. And that is certainly not our view.
Because, of course, in a democratic scenario, the idea of millions, or at least 1 million South Africans disenfranchised would become quite a sensitive one.
Oh, yes, indeed. Of course. We believe that everybody who is entitled to vote should have the opportunity to vote.
And, of course, also, a big part of the credibility of the polls that the IEC has run since the democratic era has been around participation and inclusion.
That is correct. Absolutely. And that is what we're working towards, to increase not only the participation, but also to ensure that we have a much bigger turnout than in previous years.
So where are the, I mean, as far as I understand it, the key areas where you are facing these difficulties are in Gauteng, the Western Cape and KZN?
No, not the Western Cape. The Western Cape is actually one of the provinces that are doing better in terms of addresses. The provinces where we have the challenges are in, no surprises, in the two most populous provinces, that is Gauteng and KZN, and followed by Eastern Cape.
So how did the situation arise in the first place? I mean, how were these names on the voters' roll if their addresses could not be verified?
I think that at the very outset, I think what we must understand, specifically in our glory years, the emphasis was more in terms of quantity and not so much quality. And in terms of the achievement that we had in 1999 in being able to present our very first voters' roll, there was no questions asked in terms of addresses. In fact, there was no requirement up until 2003. And as you can see, currently we have about 2.1, 2.2 million voters without an address, and nearly half of them relate to voters who have registered prior to 2003, and there was no emphasis. So a lot of this has to do with history.
So how have the political parties responded to this challenge as it is in the moment?
I think that political parties at the Political Party Liaison Committee have been very cooperative. A lot of political parties have assisted in their campaigns, specifically during the registration weekend that we have. We have provided them with list of all of these voters without addresses, and we believe that their contribution has proved some successes since the advent of this challenge that we've had. And as I've mentioned, initially we started out with about 8 million. We are currently sitting at around about 2 million in total, and only 1.3 of them is post-2003, which is the obligation that the ConCourt has placed on us to find addresses for.
I also understand you've got the additional headache of appointing more commissioners. How soon would they need to be up to speed with the processes before we can think about what must happen next in terms of an election process?
Well, first of all, I don't see it as a headache because it's just normal process. Commissioners' terms have come to an end. This is something that we've become accustomed to, and we hope to have them appointed shortly. Currently we have one vacancy, confirmed vacancy. The judge, it's a requirement that we have a judge as one of the commissioners. The judge's term has expired early last month, so we have one, but we're dealing with all of them collectively, and we hope to see some movement and have a full complement of commissioners by the time the new term should start.
So from the IEC's point of view, you're confident the court should look at the very least at what has been achieved as a measure of what needs to happen going forward?
Yes, and as I've mentioned, we also provided proof that the progress that we've made, and also going forward that the end is in sight in terms of resolving this challenge.
All right, Granville Abrahams there from the IEC. Now, the Energy Minister, Jeff Radebe, says there's an ominous threat to city governance as a result of slums. He was speaking during the first day of the African Capital Cities Sustainability Forum in Pretoria. Africa's population has reached over 1 billion people. Radebe says this is the challenge that city leaders must begin to grapple with.
The African continent, it's the second most populous in the world. More than 60% of urbanized Africans live in slums, exacerbating the challenges of inadequate drinking water, sanitation and other infrastructure.
The cost of slums rehabilitation programs are usually too high for the cities to afford, and the best way that many cities have dealt with them is to accept them as a reality of life. But there is an ominous threat to city governance as a result of slums, so we need to do something about them.
But it's believed challenges have to be approached in an African context for sustainability of growth.
We cannot be going to Europe every time or going to developed countries and then come back and think that you can automatically replicate what you have seen there. Africa has to come up with African solutions for African problems.
And a word of advice to the mayors.
when you go back to your capital cities, you can start implementing some of the decisions and the resolution that will be taken at this forum. Because those of us who have been in government, in diplomacy, we have a tendency of attending a beautiful forum, and when we go home, we even forgot that we attended a forum.
The three-day forum will also address issues of energy, global economic slowdown, sanitation, as well as the rising unemployment, among others. Mulimo Waonemuto, SABC News, Pretoria.
Senior Counsel